Okay, so this is going to be week 4 of this study that is focused on using the seven-headed beast of Revelation 13 as sort of a roadmap to understanding the world political landscape of the end times. A lot of Christian fiction literature has been written about this, and a lot of there are important Christian theologies that are developed around this. Certainly understanding the nature of the coming of the kingdom is kind of an important topic for Christians. And this study, of course, is within the premillennial futurist view of Christian theology and times, which is that Christ is yet to return. He's not returned yet. He will return in our future, and that he's coming before the kingdom actually starts. That the kingdom will have an earthly period that is inaugurated by Christ's return to the earth. And so we're not presenting arguments or the case for those conclusions in this study. That would have to be done in another study. But for people who already subscribe to those positions, what we're doing is getting into the biblical information about this. It's contained in the major passages, predominantly the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel, to kind of get an understanding of what the scene in the world is going to look like on the largest level. The Bible does a pretty good job of giving us the directions and, like I said, the roadmap based upon connection to world history. There's a ton of historical information available to us now, and a ton that was available back even in the times when the Bible was being written. And much of that understanding is the same, or there's a strong amount of overlap. And so we can map our place in history in connection to the biblical periods, and we can use Bible prophecy and the images and symbols that are used in those passages to kind of map the future, which is kind of what the Bible is intending. And you will get a better picture of that if you allow the Bible itself to do the interpretation and remove as much speculation as possible from that, and whereby we're not putting meaning into the text, we're allowing the text to supply the meaning to us. God's the authority here on future telling, not us. So the extent that we can't distinguish between our own ideas and what the scripture itself is dictating is going to cause potential confusion or problem or misdirection. And so what we're proposing is a theory that is, or a model of interpretation that is not based on and does not have an inclination for particular outcomes or particular identities regarding the people groups and the nations and the times when these things are going to occur, but rather is the most interested in being dependent strictly on biblical information for a large-scale model or pattern that, if we got it right, or the better it is, will match what will eventually be seen in world history, so that we can hopefully recognize that match when it's happening, rather than kind of getting ahead of ourselves, or putting the cart ahead of the horse and having a particular end times model in mind of what nations we're going to think are involved, and seeing if we can align that with scripture, getting scripture to match that. We want to just start with the scriptural information without any names on the table, and then understand what that looks like, so that when an eventual historical scenario unfolds that matches that, we're able to see it for what it is, rather than potentially bending the Bible to our own experiences or preferences or influences. Like I said, God's the authority here, not us. So that's what we've been doing. Again, tonight we're going to recover, again, a lot of the same things. There's going to be repetition. The reason for that is that I think there's quite a bit of depth to this particular field of study. And what we're trying to do is continually layer additional biblical information on, but we started with basic framework. And so every time we retrace our steps to show how the new material is mapping and connecting to the existing model that we've developed. So again, I'm going to start with what will kind of be repetitious, and then we'll build additional components onto that. So from previous weeks, we saw that in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, those two passages have to be, I think, taken together with regard to these main questions. And also Daniel 2, and we also have Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, and later passages of Daniel that we've looked at as well. But predominantly Revelation 13, 17, and Daniel 2 all indicate this unique component, that there are two earthly imperial powers that are present and active in the final years before Christ's return. The reason that's worth highlighting is because in the views that I grew up with, and in many Christian premillennial futurist schools of thought, there is only one major world governmental power that is active in the end times. And I think that if you're wrong about that, if that's not what the Bible is saying, then you could be at a significant deficit and disadvantage when trying to recognize when the end times are happening. And I think that the clarity with which the Bible seems to present the idea of two major world powers active at that time deserves consideration. And I'm going to lay out here again the information that I think the Bible, the data that drives that reasonable conclusion. Number one, not necessarily the strongest piece of evidence, but certainly correspondent to the other evidence which I'm about to read, is that Daniel 2 has a prophetic vision of the future, or contains a prophetic vision of the future, in which the image of a single statue, what appears to be a human figure, depicts a sequence of kingdoms starting with the Babylonians through subsequent times. And each period of time is occupying a particular segment of the anatomy of the statue: the head, then the shoulders and chest, then the belly and thighs, then the legs, and then the feet. But each people group or each imperial power in those periods of times is represented by a type of material or substance, such that the head is of gold, the shoulders and chest are made of silver, the belly and thighs of brass, the legs of iron, and then the feet have both iron and clay. And that is significant. Neither the head, nor the shoulders and chest, nor the belly of brass, nor the legs have two substances. Only one period of time, the time of the feet, has two substances. And if the rest of the statue is informative, what that means is that there's something of particular interest in that end time periods that is not apparent or of particular interest in the previous kingdoms or time periods. And that seems to be the presence of two imperial substances at that time. And again, not the strongest of the pieces of evidence, but certainly correspondent to it, where the iron and the clay at the time of the feet and the toes may indicate two different kingdoms. And we also noted that the idea of toes, of which there are normally 10, can be correspondent to the 10 horns. Both toes in this image here and horns, which we see later in Daniel 7 and in Revelation, are in the final time period. So the correspondence of the number there and the time period indicates that they are to be connected or related in some ways. And so if that's the case, then whenever we have this idea of 10, somehow in Revelation indicates that this is connected to kingdoms, so does Daniel 7, then we would expect that alongside of them, there is another kingdom as well, represented in Daniel 2 by the clay, I would say. So then when we move to Revelation 13 and 17, and we're dealing with the seven-headed beast as it is, and we know that a beast, or it can represent a larger political authority, whether it's of an earthly kingdom which has heads or horns that are derived from that power, or potentially horns which contribute to the formation of that earthly power or kingdom. In this case, we're talking about seven earthly empires and the seven angelic rulers or princes, each of which is associated with one of those earthly empires. And this is seen in part because it corresponds to the depiction of the dragon in Revelation 12. The dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns. So does the seven-headed beast in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. So there's a correspondence between the angelic kingdom and their structure and what Revelation 13 plainly tells us, which is that the devil's the one giving authority to each of the heads of these beastly structures, which are representative earthly kingdoms. Don, did you have something?
Yeah, you're making this connection between the seven earthly kingdoms and represented in Daniel, and the seven-headed dragon in Revelation, the dragon representing angelic powers, and the statue representing their earthly physical kingdoms on earth. Is that correct? I'm just gonna make sure I'm clear on
Well,
that
some of
point.
your referencing might have been inaccurately stated. There's seven-headed beasts is from Revelation and not Daniel, but I think that the
That's
substance
what
of
I
what you
meant.
said is a correct understanding of what I think I was articulating.
Okay, and is that connection able to be made in the Old Testament anywhere else, or is it a tale of we need both the Old Testament and the New Testament to make the connection?
Well, we've certainly, I think the passages in Daniel and Revelation that we've mentioned are clear enough and direct enough to establish this reality of earthly kingdoms and angelic rulers, but there are Old Testament passages in Daniel in particular, and in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 19, where God talks about how the rest of the nations were assigned to the, or divided unto the sun, the moon, and the stars, or the hosts of heaven. And then we talked about how in the classical ancient world, that is prior to the modern conceptualization through science of the world, that the sun and the moon and the stars was a reference particularly to seven heavenly objects: the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So the correspondence of seven there is potentially significant. The Jewish mentality was also that the table of nations that was listed in early Genesis, which had 70 nations in their understanding of it, corresponded to 70 angelic rulers who ruled over those nations, and then ultimately God selecting a particular and forming a people group that became his, in distinction to those which belong. So all of this is, as you're indicating, I think through your question, already present in the Old Testament, is not new. The Revelation is simply drawing from that larger established set of facts.
That's good.
Okay.
We're on that point.
Yeah, go ahead.
While we're on the question, yeah. So before he said something, you had just said, so the devil had given the beast its power or whatever behind it. But when you say that term, the devil, are we saying, like we were talking about before, like the seven head, this beast itself is one of the so-called, I mean, Apollyon is a devil himself. He's one of the angels as well. So when you say the devil gives the beast his power, are you talking about such as the seventh head beast is given by, like Apollyon gives it to his human counterpart or the Antichrist, and then the second beast, are we saying the second beast is also the one that rises out of the second, with the two powers? One, the angelic powers, and just for clarification, is that one Apollyon, and then the second one would be the devil, or the one that is sometimes missed as Lucifer, so to speak, let's say. Is that what you would say for the listeners and for us to kind of clarify these two powers? Is that the two angelic powers that we're talking that are behind it?
Yeah, so to answer your second question first, I do believe that the two-horned beast and the 10-horned beast, which are both present in the end times, the earthly powers identified with those two different beastly symbols, are ruled respectively by an angel that is identified as Abaddon or Apollyon, or we might say Hades, and that he's associated, as we've said, and I'm going to reiterate this as we keep going tonight, that Apollyon or Hades or Abaddon is associated with the 10 horns. They give him their kingdom, and that's subsequently or additionally, the two-horned beast of Revelation 13, verse 11, is ruled by an angelic king. And then I think, as we'll see, and I'll give more reasoning for tonight, but I mentioned last week, I think that two-horned beast is presided over by someone we would call the chief adversary, or frequently might be easily referred to as Lucifer, although we always put the asterisk by that term because it's a translational issue. But anyway, so that's the association that we would make, that you articulated. And the other is that I think if you look at the larger authority sourcing component, it probably looks like this. The chief adversary, or Lucifer, that particular angel, has the highest authority over the other angels that are underneath him, other satanic angels. of which 6 are highly ranking right underneath him, such that he allows each of them to preside over an earthly kingdom of particular prominence at particular times in Israel's history. At the end of the age, I believe he himself takes rule over the final or 7th of these important world empires. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then each of those angels, including Lucifer, as we might say, probably may have some role in determining what human rulers are ruling under them. There's some historical and biblical reason to suspect that kind of association, although it's unclear exactly how that connection or how direct that connection is made. Certainly Augustus, the first ruler or emperor of the Roman Empire, identified himself as the son of Apollos or Apollyon. I think that connection is made. Alexander the Great, the initial ruler of the Greek Empire, Macedonian Empire, was understood or thought himself in some respects to be the son of either Zeus or comparable to Dionysus. And so, these different angels had different names that they went by as they were worshipped under different nations. And so, you could trace that concept as well. So that's kind of how I would lay out the authority, how the authority is derived in this respect.
Why I ask that is because, like, when we look at like bullet point 2 and stuff, where it talks about the beast with the 2 horns, that beast or whatever, that kingdom seems to be associated with the devil or AKA the Lucifer or whatever. But it seems like he's promoting worship to the beast. So is he promoting worship of Apollyon? I mean, it seems like if he's the chief adversary, why is he putting? Is it just that his way of kind of saying, "Hey, I'm not doing it directly," or he's just deceiver that way, or why is he not bringing the promotion to his own self then?
Well, I'm assuming that he is bringing promotion to himself. There's other scriptural attestation. In general, that's one of the things. I think what's happening is that we're being directed towards the period of Apollyon's reemergence on the scene. And so the dragon, having already appeared on the world scene or having been present immediately just before Apollyon, is validating or pointing people towards the worship of this associate. It would be like me coming into a room and getting to know people. Well, I'll just give you a real life example. The job that I have now, I began 2 years ago, and then at a certain point, I brought Gloria in. I brought her in for an interview, and then they eventually hired her. So it's like Gloria's hiring was predicated in part by my credibility with the company and my presence there, which I was able to vouch for her and then get her on board. So that didn't mean that I was being terminated or they were no longer going to continue my employment, but merely that I was using my credibility and my position to push her into a position of use and welcome from the company. So I think it's similar to that the devil is using his power not to the exclusion of his worship, but what we're seeing is that he's using his influence to push people to worship Apollyon, in particular the region of the 10 horns, which are going to give him their kingdom. So he's promoting him there probably primarily early on. So that's my take.
And we've established that the 2-horn beast comes before the Apollyon. Okay.
I believe so. It's not directly stated or necessarily stated in that way in Revelation 13. It does say that the 2-horn beast had all the power of the first beast, which was healed, whose head wound was healed. The head that was healed, I could say it that way, before him, but it may mean simply in his presence. But I do think there is a sort of, if you follow other chronological or sequencing clues in Daniel and in Revelation, that the 7th empire and the angel that rules over it precedes the reemergence of Apollyon, who then attempts to reign in over an 8th sort of empire, even though he's already ruled previously. So the 7th has to come before the 8th if you follow the sequencing in Revelation 17. And this is similar to what we see in other historical transitions, right? The Babylonians were first on the scene. They promoted, they helped grow the Medes and the Persians and make them prosperous and strong because they were dependent client state to the Babylonians. And then ultimately the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians and the Medes as they had grown strong enough to overthrow them. And I think similarly, the Babylonians did that with the Assyrians. So I think what we're seeing is the two-horned beast will probably be in a critical mechanism. He'll be using his influence through that kingdom to help raise up the 10 horns and then subsequently empower Apollyon. So we're seeing that short period of time where those things are going on in the end. That's my take. Enoch, did you have something else you want to say? And then it looks like Don.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, yeah, that makes sense. I wasn't sure that we established that's two-horned beast came. Because when I read Revelation 13 and when it says the verse 12, whatever, it says he came out, when I see this other beast come out, and he says he has all the power of the first beast before him and causes the earth and them which dwell therein to worship him. So it seems to imply that, at least from the reading of it, that the second beast that comes out, because he said, I beheld another beast coming out with the two horns. And then he says he exercised all the power of the first beast that was before him.
Yeah.
So that's why I was thinking he came second.
I think like I said, I think that the power he has to influence people to worship the beast whose deadly wound was healed is come from the fact that he's already established as a power, right? Like his credibility, his presence, his world influence is already known, and then he's cashing that in to get them to worship the other beast. But more than that, I think Revelation also in chapter 17 depicts this particular chronological sequence, right? There's 5 have fallen, one is yet to come. And so 7 has to come after all the other 6. So if the 8th king is one of the 7, and I'm going to argue in a minute here why the 8th king is not, or the 8th sort of empire or imperial power is not the 7th, then he has to come after the 7th, right? And so there's sort of a sequencing there. And then in the larger picture of 7 heads, if 5 have fallen and 1 is by the 1st century, there's still 1 yet to come. And just sequentially, we would be forced to, if Daniel left off with what would be Rome, and Rome is number 6, then sequentially again, we would expect Revelation at some point to have to address further the 7th head. It couldn't just simply talk about the revival of a head and then leave us without any information about the 7th head. The second beast in Revelation 13:11 is exactly what you would predict, that at some point we would get some kind of beastly symbolic representation for the 7th head if Rome was 6, which is the way that it sort of left off. So I think all of those factors point towards that.
Yeah, I think that kind of answers my question, especially what last week I was asking, who was the 7th?
Mm-hmm.
So the other one kind of does fit that. Maybe it's not a prominent kingdom, but it eventually at this point, it becomes even more prominent, even more. It was already established, but maybe as the other beasts are coming or something, and then it becomes more prominent. And it does fit with the devil's characteristics of deceiving. That seems to be his forte, is his method, is deception.
Yeah.
Calling on his destruction. So
yeah, and I think that what we'll see is so I always want to say that it's not necessarily the case that let's say the 10 horns or the 2-horned beast don't have any physical or political presence in the world prior to the final 7 years. It's just that the Bible is really predominantly interested in these kingdoms only when their dominion is asserted over Israel in the land, when Israel has a temple in Jerusalem. So if there's only a temple in Jerusalem during the final 7 years, then the Bible is these empires only really qualify for prophetic status with regard to that period of time. And so I'm always trying to, maybe I should have articulated that more clearly earlier. It certainly would have done so tonight, that it's not that suddenly the 2-horned beast springs from out of nowhere into political development in the final 7 years. It's just that it's becoming one of the heads is only precipitated by the existence of a temple at that period. and the struggle that occurs there.
That makes sense. I think when you explain it. If I could give an analogy, it's like saying like somebody's coming on the scene, like an NBA player, two NBA players. This first beast is like this guy who becomes a big famous star, Giannis or whatever, and then somebody after him who's been in the league for a while. Then now he's like, yeah, that's my teammate, whatever. And then he comes out next, and then now he's prominent as well.
Yeah.
Even though he's been in the league for a while, he's there. It's just kind of like it's noted once he becomes out now, and that's when he takes on that role. He's also joining in with the other player in terms of domination over Israel or whatever. Maybe that's
right. Especially by way of that analogy, you could think of a player who's been in the league for a long time but never been on a championship team, and then he joins on a team with he's been a superstar, and then he gets on a team with a younger player who is going to the championship for the first time. And in that particular championship, they win, both of them, for the first time. It's the first time they ever both joined the champions group. One has just come into existence. One's been around before. So obviously we're mixing metaphors and analogies here, probably only confuse people more, but I think that what you were saying was pretty useful. I might've clouded it. John or Don, did you have something you wanted to say?
I was just going to say that we see that in politics all the time, right? Where you could have a president who goes to another state and promotes somebody who's running for election there, or
Right.
somebody is a head of state in one country, and because somebody in another country represents similar views, they might advocate for that person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about here, is in the realm of politics. You could easily imagine someone who of an established world power. Maybe that world power has been prominent for a period of time prior to the end times, but it is using its influence that it's amassed over a period of time to help develop and grow the 10 horns into another position of significance or cohesiveness and stability. And that could easily happen. And that, I think, has to be the frame that we're looking at, because predominantly the Bible is using these to describe what has to involve political powers and developments. So I think that makes sense. So I think this was helpful to put it out that way, because I don't know if I've laid it out in those practical terms, but it certainly is important for people to be able to visualize or think about this in real terms. Okay, so the second beast has the same kind of authority as the two-horned beast has the same kind of authority as the 10-horned beast. And so it's responsible for promoting the rising and worship of the 10-horned beast, or what the beast that will be associated with the 10 horns, we'll put it that way. So the 7 heads, they are 7 angelic kings. This is pretty clear, that while there certainly are human kings as well, that predominantly the Bible is talking about the earthly empire and then the angelic king. And that the term beast in Revelation, at least, is very clearly has an association or meaning that refers specifically to the angelic king, more than, or in some occasions entirely about that king, rather than about a human or about the kingdom they're ruling over. So beast sometimes is primarily about the angel. And so the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, we see that language both in beginning in Daniel, in Revelation 9, verse 2 and 3 and 11, introducing things that ascend out of the abyss, including an angel who's king over the abyss. And then Revelation 11:7, talking now, switching to the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit. And then Revelation 17:8, 10, 11, saying that the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit is one of the 7 kings over these empires. So it makes it pretty clear what's going on there. It's also the case that the angel that comes out of the bottomless pit is the one who is associated with the 10 horns, or the 10 kings. And so that association is clear. So we know that the angel that's returning to power is associated with the 10-horned kingdom, not the 2-horned kingdom. And we also will see what that means in terms of the 7th kingdom as well. So in the first century, if we look at it from a first century perspective, that when John is writing this, we have 5 of these angels have already fallen and been removed from their position of preeminent dominance in the world in terms of their earthly kingdom. One was presently ruling through what would be the Roman Empire of the ancient world. And this is why the early Christians and the Jewish people prior to them of this period understood Rome as Daniel's 4th beast in sequence, starting with the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. which Daniel 9 indicates the Romans, by implication, would be the people who destroyed the second temple, which they were in the first century. So all of that fits together. And this is why Revelation 17, in talking about the beast that descends out of the bottomless pit, uses these on at least three parts of verses in that sequence. The odd phrases was not, yet is. It's attempting, in my opinion, doesn't do this with the other angel kings, to give a larger picture of the overall historical pattern of this particular angelic ruler, which is unique. He rules for a period of time over a dominant world empire. He is then cast out, and then subsequently his empire loses power. He's placed himself in containment within the bottomless pit, and then he remains there without power until such time as he is released and ascends out of the bottomless pit, at which time he is given power for 42 months to rule over the kingdom of the 10 horns, who give their power to him and reign at that time. They have yet to arisen at the time of the first century. It says in Revelation that these 10 kings have not yet received their kingdom. They don't have any power in the first century. So the 10 kings are an end times political reality, even though Daniel chapter 7 associates them somehow with the Roman Empire that followed the Greek Empire. That association is at least connected and seems to be predominantly connected through the fact that the angelic king that ruled ancient Rome is also the ruler over the 10 horns or 10 kings. That's the association that seems to be made there. And so we have in Revelation 17 that this angel ruled in the past, whereas Revelation 17 will say he was, from a first century perspective, he is or yet is. He's the one that is in that sequence. He falls from power, which is the part where it indicates he was not, and then he yet is. He will exist again. So when he ascends out of the bottomless pit to rule over the 10 horns in their kingdom. And yet there's one king, one angelic king, who was yet to come in the time of the first century. He had not yet ruled. And this gives us a particularly significant characteristic for what will be the seventh of these kingdoms and the angelic prince over it, and that he only rules, the Bible is only interested in him in terms of the qualification of his earthly empire during a short period. Why? Because the temple only exists in Israel for a short period from a historical standpoint. So when we pull all of that together, we're going to get a kind of a bounce towards the next component, which is going to largely try to focus on information about the seventh king and his earthly kingdom. So we got the angels and their rule over the earthly kingdoms. The 10 horns are associated with the angel who once ruled over Rome. The period of the 10 horns is an end times period, not a first century period. It's not a medieval period. The kingdom of the 10 horns is not the same as the kingdom of the 2 horns. One has 2 horns, the other has 10. They're clearly distinct, but they're contemporaries. The seventh angelic beast king reigns only at a short period of time at the end of the age. So that's informative too, because it means there are two major reasons why the seventh king and his kingdom cannot have existed in world history prior to the end times. Number one is it says that he only rules for a short time. So you can't have the idea that the seventh kingdom is this historically lengthy period. And here's the other reason that has to be attached to it, because its significance is only when Israel has a temple, just in Jerusalem, just like the others, which is only for a short period of time. So if you're trying to identify the seventh kingdom and someone's throwing out candidates from the medieval period, for example, the problem with them is they're not end times. It's prior to the end times, and they don't exist. They're not on the stage in world power when Israel has a temple in the land, and in Jerusalem particularly. So we're looking for something that is only going to be visibly and qualified in the end times. So someone believes they've identified this at some point prior to the establishment of the temple, and they then point to the historical group that this is the kingdom that this is. prior to that, I think there's going to be immediately some question marks from me in violation of the indicators we have here. So to me, this leads to the idea that the seventh angelic beast is most likely the ruler over the two-horned beast of Revelation 13, not only because the chief adversary himself in Revelation 12 is cast to the earth with only a short period of time. He's the one who has the ultimate authority over these kingdoms, and he only has a short period. That's what Revelation 12, verse 12 explains. He goes about to deceive the nations, according to Revelation 12:9. Now, in 2 Thessalonians, it says that he will be responsible for false miracles and lying signs and wonders. The beast of Revelation 13:11 and so forth is deceiving the nations with false miracles. So the same angel, for the same amount of time, the short period of time at the end, is the seventh kingdom, doing in both cases what is associated with the two-horned beast and the devil: deception, false miracles, false religion. That's a pretty strong association. It's also a pretty unique association to a certain extent where we find those descriptions, particularly in Revelation. So this seventh empire comes after the Roman Empire. It hasn't come yet because there's no kingdom, there's no temple in Jerusalem. And so there hasn't really been any candidate empire that could possibly fit the biblical description or qualifiers for the seventh kingdom yet, predominantly because no temple, like I said. So the seventh empire is not a historically past kingdom that's existed already that we could identify in using any biblical prophetic means. And it certainly isn't then the head that's been revived or healed, because the head that's been revived or healed has already ruled an earthly empire. So there's a difficulty there. In the two-horned empire, the seventh head hasn't existed and won't exist till the end times, but the healed head, the angel that's restored to power, he's already ruled over a historical empire when Israel had a temple in Jerusalem. So those things have to be different. And so one is associated with two horns, the other with 10 horns. So I've already kind of laid that out. So one more thing about the geography, we talked about this last week. These empires, at least what we know from this historical precedent of the first six empires, is that they have a pretty significant geographical movement within the development of each empire, so that they spread from a locality in one location all the way to a very distant part of the world. And in most of these events, even the ones that are the smallest, geographically speaking, still cover a huge geographic region, particularly in the ancient world's understanding of these things, right? We measure things in terms of the sphere, and North America to the tip of South America, and South America all the way around to India. But in their experience of the world, their view of it, the world was, Asia, Europe, and Africa, particularly where those things came together. And so even the smaller ones, like Assyria, which starts in Nineveh, spreads to a pretty significant degree across the surface of the most important part of the ancient world as far as the Bible is concerned. And so the geography and the movement of these nations and these empires tells us that if we are trying to restrict our understanding of the end times versions of this to one of the historic origin points, we're probably off, because they never stuck to the origin point entirely. If you look at Rome, for example, one of the ones that's the most used in this respect, it starts in the Italian peninsula in Europe, but it spreads all the way across the Mediterranean Sea down to Egypt, and all the way eastward over to essentially where Iraq is today, and it's far enough west to go to Spain and that part of Africa, which is south of Spain. So then it resituates itself over time as a result of other factors, to the point where its capital is now centered in Turkey. Well, that's a pretty big movement. And then it survives there in that Eastern orientation for much longer, for another 1,000 years or so. So where is Rome, biblically speaking? Where's the angel who rules over it? Where is his power? Is it in Italy? Will it resurface in Italy? or is it free to roam, or to move, I should say, to avoid the pun. So the same with Greece and so on and so forth. Alexander's empire breaks into the generals and so forth. So in the end times, when we're talking about the 10 horns and the little horn that emerges among them, the Bible seems to indicate that what we're talking about is an area that is Middle Eastern. And I'm not getting into that particularly in the study. Gog and Magog is in Eastern Turkey, essentially southern, central, and Eastern Turkey. The Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, and then the sub-kingdom of the Greeks that called the Seleucids, or the kings of the north, as Daniel 11 calls them, all overlapped in that area from southeast Turkey, the eastern half of Turkey, southward through Syria and Lebanon, parts of Jordan, into northern Israel down to Jerusalem. And so that's the area we should probably be looking at for the resurgence of this. And so I won't get any further into that tonight, but that's just to acknowledge something that other scholars have pointed out. I do believe that that is likely where we're to see the 10 horns emerge from, and where we're going to probably see the reconstitution of the power given to the angel who was once over the ancient Roman Empire, but whose empire itself moved eastward and further eastward to that same area where it eventually resided in Eastern Turkey, or in Turkey in Constantinople. So this takes us into a look at the seventh head, more particularly the seventh kingdom, the seventh angel. And what I want to do is talk about this first through the idea of the information we have in Revelation 17, which we've already seen is pretty relevant, either way in that case, to this discussion of the seven kingdoms and the angels that rule over them. And so in Revelation 17, we start with the description, again, the mentioning of the seven-headed beast with 10 horns. And it states that this beast is being ridden by a woman that it calls a harlot. And then we see a description of this harlot that eventually includes the declaration with pretty clear language that she is the city that rules over the kings of the earth and many peoples and nations. So that, again, is a political thing. It seems to be involving a political description, reigning over kings. It can have spiritual aspects as well, but it certainly would seem to include political power. And what I want to point out, and again, this is not something that we're alone in subscribing to, although I believe our modeling of this is earlier than when I've seen it from other people. That's not to say they didn't have this in mind at the same time we did. Just trying to say that these are independent to the extent that we and others have come to this conclusion. They're independent, as far as I'm aware, of one another. So when Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2, which we've already mentioned, is struggling with, he wants to know the meaning of this vision that he's seen. And he turns to the Babylonian wise men and he's like, tell me what it means. And they can't, they don't explain it. Now, his initial thought is that they could explain it, but they know what the meaning is and that it's not good for him. He actually perceives that what he says is, you know that the times are being changed and you're essentially waiting it out. He suspects that they're aware that the vision indicates something about the transition of power, and that they think that they can just not tell him that his end is coming or something, and that they'll be fine. Now, if you read through the rest of Daniel as it progresses, you find out that the rulers of Babylon lived to see the transition of power to the Persians, and that immediately when the Persians come in, they essentially leave the same people in power over that province of Babylon under the Persian emperor and still serving him. So they do seem to do what Nebuchadnezzar suspects. But the interesting component here, the reason I'm mentioning, is the idea of a group of people who are kind of present in each one of these empires, and that being associated with, at least in the time of Babylon, these Chaldean wise men, sort of nobility, aristocratic class, probably merchants, certainly having maybe some religious belief system that they were associated with. And in that sense, the presence of these guys within each of the kingdoms, within each of the capital cities or empires of capital cities or leading cities of the empires, is somewhat similar to the idea of a woman riding each of the heads of the beast, the seven-headed beast. She's present, she's staying along with this, right? They're riding the political system. But the reason that the thing that this leads to, or that should be included along with this, is that in reality, this terminology about a great city that is a harlot, along with some of the associated descriptions in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, about the harlot city, are used in earlier biblical passages to describe the great cities or the leading cities of some of the other known seven empires that are part of this particular biblical grouping. So, for example, the capital city of Assyria was Nineveh. And it's there in Nineveh that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, he's killed by his sons while worshiping his eagle-headed god known as Nisroch, according to the books of Kings. But so Assyria's capital is Nineveh. Egypt's ancient capital, or one of them, was a city that in the Bible is called No, N-O, but is also really, it's more commonly known as Thebes. And then we know of the Babylonian city of Babylon. The Romans had both Rome, Italy, and then later Constantinople. And the Bible does attest to each of those in this same terminology that we find in Revelation 17. For example, here in Nahum chapter 3 of the Old Testament, it's describing different things. It says, "Woe to the bloody city. It is full of lies and robbery." It talks about the horsemen and the chariots, and it talks about the great number of slain. And it says in verse 4, "Behold," it says, "because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, mistress of witchcraft, which sells the nations through her whoredoms," or her fornication or infidelity, "and families through her witchcraft. I will show the nations her nakedness and her shame, that they will look upon thee and flee from thee. Nineveh is laid waste." Right? So here's Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, one of the beastly king empire predecessors, is being described, this capital city, in this same way, in much of the same language, much shorter description than in Revelation 17. And then it says in verse 8 about Nineveh, it says, "Well, are you better than Thebes? Are you better than the ancient capital of Egypt?" Meaning Egypt also kind of fits this description. Egypt's capital city of Thebes, or No, fits this, right? Talking about how No, or Thebes, the capital of Egypt, was on the waters, right? And it literally was, but Revelation uses that language as well to talk about the harlot city, which may also be a harbor city. Then in the New Testament, Peter, at the end of his life, the early church tells us Peter died in Rome. And in his epistle, as he's writing, and he's aware in his epistles that his life is nearing its end, he's writing, and he says he's writing from what he calls Babylon. Now, Peter never went to Iraq, as far as any of us know, but he did go to Rome. And so he's applying the same title that's given in Revelation to the capital of the then empire of Rome, which was situated in Italy. So here, this common approach when we get to Revelation 17, and we see the great harlot, the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth, according to verse 18, and with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. She sits on many waters. And then one of her names is Babylon. So what we're seeing here is that each of these empires had a great city that was the harlot city of their day, that was probably, in the case of, we look at Egypt and we look at Babylon, for example, the place where this aristocratic culture, the Persians after the Babylonians, of what we would call wise men astrologers who made up the court or the nobility, certainly were responsible in part for the religious beliefs of the kingdom, or at least embodied those things, the mystery cults and those sort of things that were part of these ancient pagan worlds. They're present in each one of these kingdoms. And so when the harlot is described in Revelation 17, it's not this new thing that's never been discussed before. It's not this separate thing that is now, we got to put that into the equation. It's simply focusing in on something that's already part of it, which is that there have been these seven earthly kingdoms. Each is ruled by an angelic king, and each of those kingdoms has a great city in its own time. Babylon was the great harlot city of its own day. Nineveh was the great harlot city of its own day. So what is the great harlot city of Revelation 17? It is simply the great city of one of these two empires that will exist at the end of the world. And this is another reason that the Bible indicates, I believe, that there are two empires at the end of the age, because the 10 horns, which are associated with one of those empires, they hate this city and they destroy it with fire, which in just natural reasoning, basic logic would lean towards the idea that the harlot city is not a city that is a part of or valued or essential to the nations of the 10 horns. It seems to be an opposition, an enemy city to them. And so this makes sense in the historical pattern. When the Persians come in, they take over Babylon, right? They ransack Babylon. They destroy Babylon, or at least in that case, they ransack it. They don't destroy it, they keep it in existence. But in other cases, there would be a complete destruction of the capital city. And so that's what the 10 horns want to do, is destroy the capital city of the two horns. There is both cooperation between the angelic princes in their plan, and then in the earthly case, as they've done before, they have no problem transitioning between the Assyrians to the Babylonians and then dumping the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians to the Persians, and then dumping the Babylonians. And Nebuchadnezzar is kind of aware of this, and he's suspecting that the wise men are aware of this because they're consulting with the stars and the heavens, and they're trying to understand these things, and they're just buying their time. And so he's like, no, this is going to happen. So that's what's happening, I believe, as far as Revelation is describing these transitions and why this is going on. But the description overall that we have in the book of Revelation, chapter 17 and 18, and then a little bit into chapter 19 of this harlot city, contains a ton of information about this city and the culture. And just to again restate this, and then I'll get to Don in just a second, this harlot city is got to be associated with one of these two world powers. It's most likely associated with the two-horned power because it's hated by the 10 horns. So it's natural, since we have two options, to associate it with the alternative. Historical information of how this usually works fits that idea. And so when we've got a ton of information about the 10 horns, this set of descriptions from Revelation 17 and 18 about the harlot city will give us additional clues about the seventh kingdom and the characteristic features of that kingdom, which are seen and demonstrated through its capital city or its great city. Don, were you going to say something?
No, that's all right.
Okay. So just to give you guys a taste of that, but since it's almost 8 o'clock, we may hold off on the bulk of this material until next week. But I want to read through just a snippet of Revelation 17, and then we'll read through a portion of Isaiah 23, just to kind of give you an idea where we're going with this. And actually, we're going to start in Revelation 18, where we see the description we've looked at in Revelation 17 about the harlot is, according to the final verse of chapter 17, the great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. And then he talks about how after this, he sees an angel come down making a declaration about the fall of Babylon. And he says, the term Babylon there being a title for this great city. So we know that association is there. We know this is sort of a transferable title. Even Revelation uses the term of one city name to reference another, right? In chapter 11, it refers to the great city that is known as Sodom and Egypt. Well, those are two very different cities of different locations, Sodom and Egypt, but they're both being used to refer to the city where our Lord was crucified, which is Jerusalem. So here the term Babylon in this case is being applied to another city that is not actually the historical city of Babylon. But anyway, as it describes this city in chapter 17, and particularly chapter 18, where we're at, all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornications. The kings of the earth have become rich through that. The merchants of the earth are waxed rich through her delicacies. God calls his people out of them, talking about the iniquities of this. And then we go on to talk about the plagues of this city, that she is burned with fire in verse 8. And the kings of the earth have lived in luxury with her, and they are lamenting when she's destroyed, that she's been destroyed so quickly, and they mourn. And the merchants of the earth are mourning because her destruction is a problem for their business. It's going to hurt their business. So this city is a city of tremendous wealth. And then it talks about the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple, notice that, and silk and scarlet. Notice that. And all the wood and ivory and embroideries and those sorts of things, ointments and oils and wine and flour and chariots and slaves and horses and wheat that are sold. This is just a big market, a big economic center. And then it says that those who see your destruction, the merchants, weep from afar off, seeing that this has happened. And then it talks about as many ships and sailors and shipmasters and all that trade by the sea are weeping because of her destruction. So there's this association of ships and seafaring and trading by naval powers and naval trade routes, seeing that this happens. And the noise stopping of the bridegroom and all of that stuff. And it says that the nations were deceived by her. So, we already see parallels to what we read in Nahum just a moment ago in his description of Nineveh, capital of Assyria, and the capital of Egypt. And then we can turn to a passage like Isaiah, where we're going to find additional things. So I'm not going to get too deep into Isaiah tonight. I just want to read far enough to show you some of the similar language here. That Revelation 17, particularly chapter 18, has got to be aware of. I mean, John certainly is aware of these. If you had two students who both turned in papers describing a city that they lived in with the similarities that are present in these passages, you would realize that one of them had probably, they were either describing the same city or that one of them had copied off of the other one's language, and that shows some kind of correspondence. So here, I'm not trying to say that the end time city that's described in chapter 18 of Revelation is Nineveh, or is the city of Thebes, or is Rome, Italy. I'm saying it's simply the end time city of another one of the empires, and it could be located in any other location, but it's being described in the same terms. And here's another place where we find even more of those term overlaps. And we're gonna tonight just briefly look at Isaiah, and then we'll look at Isaiah and then several passages from Ezekiel where this is going on. But look at, keeping in mind what we just read in chapter 18 of Revelation, look at Isaiah 23. The burden of Tyre, howl, you ships of Tarshish, for Tyre is laid waste. There's no home, no entering into it. From the land of Kittim, it is revealed to them. Be still, you inhabitants of the isle, the merchants of Zidon that pass over the sea, which have been filled, and by the waters of the seed of Sihor, the harvest of the river, her revenue, she is a mart, a trader of nations. Be ashamed, Zidon, for the sea has spoken, the strength of the sea, saying, I travail not, nor do I bring forth children, or nourish young men, or bring up virgins. And at the report of Tyre, the ships and the isles, they mourn, they lament the joyous city's destruction. The crowning city, verse 8, whose merchants are princes, whose traders or traffickers are the honorable men of the earth. The Lord has purposed it and has stained the pride of glory, and to bring into contempt the honorable of the earth. Right? And so it goes on to talk about the destruction of the merchant city here. And you can see some of the similarities. Look at verse 15. It says, and I see someone's put something in the chat. He says, the Tyre will sing as a harlot. And so it talks about returning to her hire and committing fornication with the kingdoms of the world in verse 17, and all of her merchandise and clothing, it will all be laid waste, right? And so you can see that there's some similarities here that are worth considering further, right? Like these passages in Isaiah 23 and Revelation 18, gosh, there's some striking similarities. Well, we don't know exactly what that similarity is meant to signify or mean for us, but hopefully we can at least see that the similarity of language, which is pretty astounding in my assessment, deserves further investigation so that we might try to discern what that meaning is. And so in the weeks ahead, next week, we will visit some additional passages in Ezekiel, and then we'll talk about why Revelation is pulling this language and what it's saying through the overall picture. It's putting together for us about this great city of the final, or I think 7th empire, and what we can learn by the use of these kinds of allusions or references to these earlier passages. What it's trying to tell us about this is very helpful. We might wonder, hey, where's the 7th kingdom going to be? What's it going to look like? And the Bible's like, well, I'm trying to give you a roadmap so you can understand history and maybe be watchful about the times. It would make sense for the Bible to then give us some additional descriptions so that we might know the characteristics as much as we can of what one of these final empires is going to look like, and the way it's going to operate in the world. And it can do that, as it does through these other passages, by pointing towards historical precedent that it can say it's going to be like that. It's going to be something like that. And then we have to figure out whatever like that means. But clearly there is some kind of connection here. So that's going to be what I present tonight. Enoch put in the text chat, Atlantis.
I just put that in the chat. I didn't mean to. I wouldn't want to say it out loud because I didn't want to bring it into a whole rabbit trail. But I know that reference that passage has been referenced by many a lot of times when they're talking about potential stories of these legends of this loss of a great city like Atlantis of some sort, or some other city in the past, or if there's some connection with the Bible's term of the city that lost in the sea that you just referenced. But if you think about some of the pagan kind of things that were going on with so-called legends or whatever that's happened in whatever that was, maybe this Babylon city in the future will have similar kind of trading of deceptions and other things that are not honesty and God and the reign of God, and just knowledge, forbidden knowledge, different things of that nature. So
yeah, I think that so I wouldn't make any direct connection here to the whatever ancient city Atlantis may or may not have been, but I do think that both Atlantis and this have a lot in common that point towards some sort of larger awareness or historical awareness, or even like semi-legendary or mythological awareness of the great city, the great trade city that is using the sea as its main means to get its power and to trade and to be wealthy and exert influence. And the demise of that city, that part of the pattern seems the same. So it may be the case that Atlantis is sort of a fragmented sort of discussion that's preserved in the ancient Greek texts and other cultures of something that was known about this kind of phenomenon. And so the Bible, again, is capturing the reality, giving the details, and preserving the truth in a way that the ancient pagan traditions just failed to do. So
yeah, and also like you said, if it's also this thing of this news, this Revelation Babylon city or whatever, they also like they're drunken with the abominations. It's not just trade too. It's this also some kind of negative, devil kind of knowledge and information and stuff that they're drunken with abominations. They're making the world drunk with these kind of abominations.
And I didn't.
Babylon, and those people were doing those sorcerers or whatever in Daniel's time, they were also filling them with a lot of stuff that was pagan and not leading them to Yahweh. So I think that could be similar to what we're talking with Atlantis or whatever knowledge that they had or whatever the nation might have been.
Yeah, and it's good to bring that up, but I could have spent more time on it. If you look in the book of Daniel, what do these this sort of cult or court of wise men and mystics do? Well, they tried to use their position of power in the kingdom and association with the king to entrap Daniel and his fellow faithful Jewish companions to worship things that they ought not. What do they do under the Persians? Once Darius gets in, the exact same thing. What is Revelation depicting? A period of time when people of great wealth and political power are using that power to attempt to coerce those who would be faithful and following God to worship things that they shouldn't. So the MO is the same here. The status and the nature of their prominence, both politically and financially, is the same, and in all of these kingdoms. And so what the harlot appears to be some unique or novel thing, it's really just something we should have seen and known before, and see exactly how it fits with this. And so, yeah, I think that's all worth mentioning, that this is part of her role as being the mechanism to influence people towards false religion, which was going on from the Babylonian Chaldeans in the city of Babylon. It was going on under the Persians, it was going on under the Greeks, to some extent, certainly under the Romans. It's just always been present to try to get God's people to join them And God's saying, no, don't join them. Separate from them. Leave them. Stay faithful to me. Be my people. Don't be them. They belong to the stars, to the angels. So, yeah.
Can I get a spoiler alert? I mean, you don't have to spill the beans early, but are you going to reveal what's the city name or your proposition? Is it what is it going to be? Let's see. Washington, D.C. What is it going to be?
Well, so what we're going to do, true to the study, is we're going to talk about the model and the indicators of the general characteristics. At the end of that, we may leave some time for speculations along the lines of, okay, if this were to happen soon, what cities in this world today would potentially fit these kinds of descriptions, or what nations in this world would seem to fit these descriptions. As we see, it's sort of transient. It depends on what period of time you're in. There always is one or more world culture that kind of fits that sort of, some of these sort of descriptions. And so there's other factors to be considered, including if you're in the right period of time or not. So if you operate under the hypothetical speculation that this happens soon, which is a reasonable biblical consideration, then we can say, well, okay, if we've got the model right, who fits it, rather than starting with who do we not like, what are we suspicious of, and then seeing if we can map that to the Bible. We're going to just start with the Bible, and then we can do the other stuff, hopefully in a responsible way. Yeah, but I won't do that tonight.
No spoilers. All right.
Tune in next time. Yeah. All right, let me close the recording, and then we can keep chatting if we want. We'll certainly do prayer requests. Give me 1 sec.